The purpose of this meeting, as was stated before, is largely informational, for information sharing on different issues in the Middle East. It's not intended as a forum for partisan presentations of any kind, and we hope that in the question and answer period, everyone will get a chance to ask questions, and that people will limit their questions so as to allow everyone to have a chance to participate. The format of the meeting is that we have two speakers. First, Professor Chomsky and then Professor Dershowitz. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then following that, and we ask you to refrain from asking questions during their speeches or between the two speeches, because immediately after the two speeches, we'll have about an hour to ask questions. Both Professor Chomsky and Professor Dershowitz will address themselves to the question of what would you consider to be a just and lasting solution in the Middle East? And first, Professor Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics at MIT, will speak.
There are quite a lot of things I'd like to say, and I want to try to keep within the 20-minute limit, more or less. Hope more. So I hope you'll excuse me if I read most of this instead of the usual rambling, which is, I suppose, more interesting, but more likely to wander off and not get to the points I want to get to. Well, the topic that we've been asked to limit ourselves to primarily, essentially, is in fact a limited but a very important one. And I do want to address myself to it in a moment. But it would be pointless, I think, to try to consider the question of what would be a just solution to the Arab-Jewish conflict without, if we take this in total abstraction from developments in the region and in the international arena. So what I would like to do then is to divide my remarks into three parts. First, I want to say a couple of things about the situation as it appeared to me to be, say, as of October 1st, 1973, just before the war. Second, I want to say a couple of things about the situation as it seems to me to appear to be evolving today in the light of the fighting in October. And in this context, then, finally, I want to talk about principles of what seemed to me to be a just solution to the problem, and also about the prospects for moving to it. Now, only under the third category will I express directly, at least, my own views as to the rights and the wrongs of this conflict. But to avoid any misunderstanding, I ought to perhaps point out at the beginning that my own personal views diverge in what seem to me, at least, to be quite fundamental ways from the positions of any major party concerned, at least as I understand their views. So you shouldn't be under the misunderstanding or the false belief that I'm speaking for some organized group, at least, that exists so far as I know. The first point, then, what of the situation as of immediately prior to the war, say, beginning of October? Well, at that point, Israel seemed firmly in control. Israeli generals were assuring their countrymen that Israel was stronger militarily than any European NATO power, and that it could conquer most of the Middle East and North Africa within a week. Furthermore, it was argued that the United States would continue to support Israel as the guardian of Western interests. As General Rabin put it last July, Israel need not be concerned about military support from the United States because American experts are saying more and more openly that if some medieval-type rulers really mean to endanger the oil needs of hundreds of millions of people in the civilized world, then the West is permitted to take harsh steps to prevent this. Now, this view, this is the former ambassador, who I think is in fact here or was here recently. This view that Israel would be the watchdog for Western interests, to use a phrase that was, I think, used perhaps first by the editor of Haaretz in 1951. This position is not a new one. You can trace it far back. You can trace it at least as far as Jabotinsky's argument, the right-wing Zionist argument during World War I, when he argued as follows, I'm quoting, In the Middle East, nationalism will spread among indigenous populations. Only the stable support of a nation that is foreign in culture and social forms from other peoples in the region can serve as a prop for the British forces in this region. Thus, the Zionists tell the British that support for their aspirations would assure the empire of an important strategic outpost under conditions that would improve as Zionism was implemented. This is at the time of the discussions about the Balfour Declaration. Now, at one time, views such as these, views such as Jabotinsky's, were the views of reactionary extremists. Now, on the other hand, they're expressed by leading political and military figures. This point, this change, has been noted by many people, in particular by the very well-informed Zionist historian John Kimchi, who just published a useful book on this subject in which he explains that, I'm quoting, the decisive development of the past 50 years is that Israel had become the major military factor in the Middle East. It can strike at will with only the tacit approval of the U.S. government and has thus become indispensable to the United States, since the United States, because of the parity arrangements with the Soviet Union, is incapable of striking directly by itself in support of its interests. Now, under these assumptions, dual assumptions, first as to the military hegemony of Israel in the region, second, the general assumption that it was acting as the watchdog of American interests in the area, under these dual assumptions, the Israeli government was proceeding with its plans for incorporating all of the territories that were occupied in the 1967 war, or at least the majority of those territories. In August 1973, quite extensive plans were announced in the Israeli press for new settlements in the occupied areas, including new towns, new villages, and so on, for considerable expropriation of Arab lands, for purchase of lands in the occupied areas by the Jewish National Fund, and recall that the consequence of that is that Arabs are excluded by law from using or even working on these lands after that point. All of this was in accordance with the position that was expressed in August by the Minister of Commerce and Industry that, I'm quoting, "We regard Israel and the occupied territories as a single economic unit." In August, the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, called for almost doubling the jurisdictional area of the city, and equally significant, the labor alignment, that's the ruling party, adopted an electoral program that called for virtual annexation of the occupied territories. This is the Galilee Protocols, which were adopted as an electoral program for the October 31st elections. Actually, I think if you look at it carefully, that program is worse than annexation. Instead of giving my view, let me give the editorial comment in Haaretz, which is sort of the Israeli New York Times, on September 4th, which noted that the government gave its approval to Dayan's demand to set up settlements and towns within Judea and Samaria, that means the occupied West Bank, without annexation and without changing its status as an occupied area. Through the initiative of Dayan, it will be possible to take over territories without annexing them and without granting their inhabitants, the Arabs, the rights of citizens in Israel. These plans, incidentally, went well beyond the West Bank. For example, they included plans for an industrial town on the Golan Heights. They included plans for developments in the Rafah area south of Gaza, from which thousands of Bedouins had recently been expelled in a recent scandal that caused some protest in Israel. And they also included consideration of a deep water port south of Gaza and a good deal else. Now recall that this is the electoral program of the governing party, and furthermore the program of the less expansionist of the two major parties. Now, I suspect that these programs were a factor, maybe a significant factor, at least in the timing of the October War. And furthermore, they go a long way towards explaining the hostility towards Israel on the part, for example, on the part of the African states. Now, in the United States, this hostility is often described as cowardice in the face of Arab oil pressure. But I'm happy to say that the Israeli press, as usual, is more realistic than its American analog. Again, in Haaretz, a commentator speaking of the decision of Zaire, former Congo, to break relations with Israel, points out correctly, I'm sure, that there is every reason to accept Mobutu's statement that our continued settlement of the territories conquered in 1967 is the main reason for his decision. Changing borders by force of arms is, for reasons peculiar to Africa, received very negatively by African leaders. My only qualification is that there's nothing peculiar to Africa about that kind of thinking. In fact, the same kind of reasoning goes a long way to explain why the European Common Market has taken the position it has. We read here comments by distinguished professors and others saying that if united, the Western powers could resist the oil boycott. And I suppose that's true, though curiously irrelevant, because the point is that these comments fail to recognize that Western Europe has never accepted the American policy of support for permanent Israeli occupation of the territories, and therefore will see no reason to be united in pursuit of this objective with the United States, quite apart from any pressure or boycott. Israeli policy has been based over the last few years with increasing clarity to the outside and very likely even to the people themselves who are implementing it, has been based on the principle that was expressed last spring by Dayan that, quote, Jews and Arabs can live together only under Israeli military occupation. This very dangerous, in my view, suicidal policy is a major factor in the almost complete diplomatic isolation of Israel, a very dangerous development for it, which Israel can now really count for support, quite literally, only on the United States, South Africa, and Portugal, and I suspect not even on these powers any longer. I've long felt that this was a suicidal policy, and I think that in the long run, and I think that recent events show that the long run is not so long as it seemed. In any event, as of October 1st, these policies did seem fairly successful, and correspondingly, American support for these policies also seemed a qualified success. Israel and Iran were firmly in the American orbit, as were Jordan and Saudi Arabia, which of course is the centerpiece of this whole story. Egypt had expelled Russian advisors and was appealing for American investment and support. The Palestinians had been crushed in 1970 and 71. The major oil producers and the major military powers were firmly within the American system, and the forces of radical nationalism seemed to have been repressed or constrained. There was every reason then to believe, as I'm sure was believed, that the American policy was essentially succeeding. But there was always an element of risk in this policy. Plainly, Egypt and Syria would not accept permanent Israeli occupation, though Jordan and Saudi Arabia might. Hence, there was the risk of war. But this risk was universally regarded as slight on the assumption that Israel remained the overwhelmingly dominant military force. Now, Sadat's gamble on October 6th proved, to the great surprise of virtually all observers, that this assumption was fallacious. Israel failed to win a decisive and overwhelming military victory. It did not succeed in trampling Arab faces in the mud, as its Arab language broadcasts promised, nor did it succeed in breaking the bones of the enemy, nor did it succeed in conquering the area from Baghdad to Khartoum to Algeria within a week, as General Sharon had explained it could only a few months before. In fact, I think that the Egyptian-Syrian military success undermined the fundamental assumption of U.S. and Israeli policy. Saudi Arabia was compelled to employ the oil weapon. My guess is it was compelled reluctantly. And a very dangerous rift was created between the United States and its allies. Again, I believe that these facts will set the stage for a significant revision of U.S. policy. And with that, let me turn to the second topic, namely the developing situation. The fact is that the United States has always had a second policy option, an alternative to the policy that it has been pursuing, namely what is called the Rogers Plan. And I think the United States will now shift to that policy. This plan requires that Israel return to something very much like the 1967 borders, in accordance with the UN resolution as it's understood throughout most of the world, with demilitarized zones in the surrounding areas. That's the UN resolution of November 1967. With demilitarized zones in surrounding areas, with a formal peace treaty, including recognition of Israeli sovereignty, and very likely with some kind of Palestinian state, maybe, on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a kind of a mini-state which will be subject to the will of Israel and Jordan, which in the past have followed quite similar policies in this and other respects, and will probably continue to do so. Under this plan, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf oil producers will return to their role as American client states, and Egypt will join this system too, in accordance with the desires of the Egyptian bourgeoisie and military. The result, I think, will be a kind of Latin American solution with direct American support for the reactionary Arab states, as in the past, now Egypt as well, and with Israel embedded in this system as a kind of a garrison state wholly dependent on the United States, still a powerful military force and the most advanced industrial society in the region, but with limited aspirations and capacities, more limited at least. Such an outcome, I think, could be stable. It would serve the interests of the superpowers. It would amount to a kind of recolonization of the Middle East. But it has long been clear that this will be the likely consequence of the policies pursued by all of the local actors in this unhappy confrontation. Now, I'm speculating now, of course, but it seems to me that this is the turn that U.S. policy will take or has already taken, though a bitter political struggle will probably take place in the United States and maybe in Israel as the outlines of this policy become more clear. As for Egypt, it accepted the Rogers Plan at once, and its public statements and behavior at least seem to go along with it as far as I can tell. The same, I think, is true of Jordan and Saudi Arabia, though the problem of Jerusalem will likely prove crucial here. The Palestinian leadership, which is in any event powerless, has reluctantly accepted this program, apparently under strong Russian pressure. The crucial question, I think, is whether Israel will accede to U.S. pressure and will renounce and reverse the policies of the last few years. This will be a bitter pill, but I think that Israel has successively cut off of its options and now has very little room to maneuver. If the United States commands, I think it must obey, however reluctantly. The most difficult policy shift in this whole complex in Israel will be the recognition of the Palestinians. Much has been made in the West of the refusal of the Arab states to negotiate directly with Israel, irrational in my opinion. But it has less often been noted that Israel not only refuses categorically to negotiate with the Palestinians, but even officially denies that they exist. The problem is a very long-standing one. It has deep roots. In one aspect, they were expressed by the leader of the extreme right, Menachem Begin, when he warned a kibbutz audience of the danger that was inherent in recognizing a Palestinian people, only a few years ago, 1969. Asked about this, he responded as follows: "My friend, take care. When you recognize the concept of Palestine, you demolish your right to live in Ein HaChoresh. If this is Palestine and not the land of Israel, then you are conquerors and not tillers of the land. You are invaders. If this is Palestine, then it belongs to a people who lived here before you came. Only if it is the land of Israel do you have a right to live in Ein HaChoresh and in Degania Bet. If it is not your country, your fatherland, the country of your ancestors and of your sons, then what are you doing here? You came to another people's homeland, as they claim, you expelled them, and you have taken their land." Now this is the voice of the extreme right, but it touches a chord. There's no doubt of that. It echoes an important debate, which I believe will reawaken again, that goes back to the origins of the Zionist movement. For example, in 1907, Yitzhak Epstein, who was an early settler of the 1880s, wrote in a Zionist periodical that Zionism should be based on justice and law, absolute equality, and human brotherhood. He called for a radical change in 1907 in the approach to the Arabs, saying, unless we want to deceive ourselves deliberately, we have to admit that we have thrown people out of their miserable lodgings and taken away their sustenance. And he objected to this policy. He was reprimanded as a person who has what was called a diaspora way of thinking, with the comment that the main thing we should take into account is what is good and effective for ourselves. Now, I can't take the time here to recount the long debate both before and after. Perhaps it's enough to quote again John Kimchi's summary of the long history of what he calls the curious Israeli refusal to consider the Palestinian solution. He says it was as if the assertion of a Jewish nation required the rejection of the existence of a Palestinian nation. This curious refusal will have to be overcome if Israel is to accept the solution that I suspect will now be imposed by the superpowers. Well, finally, third topic, will this be a just and desirable solution? As I guess is implicit in what I've been saying, I don't think so. Israel will remain a Jewish state. That is a state based, and one must admit this, I am sure, a state based on discrimination and oppression in law and in practice. For there is no other way for a state with non-Jewish citizens to remain a Jewish state. That is to say that there will be a continuation of the policies which can be unfortunately well documented of expropriation, of expulsion, of the formation of pure Jewish cities and residential areas by law and practice, of exclusion of Arabs from state lands, lands owned in the name of the Jewish people, of repression of independent political activity, all of which can well be documented. And it will continue to be true, as the Israeli liberal Amnon Rubinstein, who you occasionally read in the New York Times Magazine, pointed out in Haaretz just a couple of weeks ago, that the moment the magic word security is uttered, the wheels of the machine of justice slow down. This happens even when these security reasons cannot convince a reasonable man. No experienced lawyer would advise the uprooted people of Biram and Ikrit to resort to the Court of Appeals in order to fight the closing orders of the Northern Regional Commander, who had illegally evicted them from their lands. Experience proves that there is no point in such appeals. This is the view of a liberal law professor, and it is quite accurate. Furthermore, Israel, I believe, under these circumstances will remain a garrison state, dependent on the superpowers, and it will furthermore remain a state with a very strong element of religious coercion internally. It's important to remember that in Israel today, the rabbinate is rapidly developing into a firmly institutionalized church, imposing an exacting discipline on its members and facing the general body of laymen as a distinct power. This is not a religious development, but ironically enough, it is the outcome of the emergence of the state. The latter has given birth and legitimacy to an established church. Incidentally, that's not my view solely. I was quoting all of those remarks from Jacob Talman, the outstanding and rather conservative historian of the Hebrew University, who points out, incidentally, that none of these developments have any roots at all in Jewish tradition, though they do result from the emergence of the state by dynamics which are not obscure. Now, the new Palestinian state, I believe, will be even worse, certainly no better, in all of these respects. I suspect it will be a kind of a mirror image diminished in scale of the Jewish state, with a built-in hopelessness and frustration and bitterness and failure. In this way, history, I think, will realize the worst fears of the early Zionist leaders. People like Arthur Rupin, who was in charge of colonization in the 1920s, and who exactly 50 years ago warned that a Jewish state of 1 million or even a few million after 50 years will be nothing but a new Montenegro or a new Lithuania. Herzl's concept of a Jewish state was possible only because he ignored the presence of the Arabs. Zionism, he urged, must discard Herzl's diplomatic and imperialist approach, and he was not alone in this view. Beryl Katzenelson, another outstanding Zionist leader, in 1931, addressing a Mapai conference, said, "I do not wish to see the realization of Zionism in the form of a new Polish state, with Arabs in the position of the Jews and Jews in the position of the Poles, the ruling people. For me, this would be the complete perversion of the Zionist ideal. Our generation has been witness to the fact that nations aspiring to freedom, who threw off the yoke of subjugation, rushed to place this yoke on the shoulder of others. Over the generations in which we were persecuted and exiled and slaughtered, we learned not only the pain of exile and subjugation, but also contempt for tyranny. Was that only a case of sour grapes? Are we now nurturing the dream of slaves who wish to reign?" I think it's not too late for the answer to that question to become no. And I believe that after the experience of living in their new Montenegros and Lithuanias, Jews and Arabs may turn to a better way, a way which has always been a possibility. This better way will be based on the principle that neither nation will dominate the other. Each people will have the right to participate in self-governing institutions, any individual self-governing national institutions, Any individual will be free to live where he wants, to be free from religious control if he wishes. In my opinion, this society in the former Palestine should be based on the principle that all Palestinians who were driven from their homes or who fled have the right to return, as do Jews who wish to find their place in this national homeland. In this society, there should be no oppressive or discriminatory legislation or any such administrative practice, as exists in the Jewish state and as will certainly exist in the Palestinian state as well. It will not be a Jewish state, it will not be an Arab state, but rather a multinational democratic society. Now, many schemes can be imagined that would realize such principles as these in a concrete way. Let me just cite one, which is by no means the only one. The regime must at all times assure both the Jews and the Arabs the possibility of unhampered development and full national independence, so as to rule out any domination by Arabs of Jews or by Jews of Arabs. The regime must foster the rapprochement, accord, and cooperation of the Jewish people and the Arabs in Palestine. Palestine will be a federal state comprising an alliance of cantons, autonomous districts, some with Jews in the majority, some with Arabs. There will be national autonomy of each people, with exclusive authority in the matters of education, culture, and language. Matters of religion will be under the control of autonomous religious congregations organized as free statutory bodies. The highest body of the state will be the Federal Council, consisting of two houses, one representing nationalities in which Jews and Arabs will have equal representation, one in which representatives of the cantons will participate in proportion to their respective populations. Any federal law and any change in the federal constitution can be enacted with only the agreement of both houses. This, I think, is a feasible way of realizing these general principles. Incidentally, again, this is not my view, my idea, rather. I was quoting from Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion, in a proposal that he made in 1930. And these were views that he continued to repeat through the 1930s, pointing out in the 17th Zionist Congress of 1931 that we declare before world opinion, before the workers' movement, and before the Arab world that we shall not agree, either now or in the future, to the rule of one national group over the other, nor do we accept the idea of a Jewish state, which would eventually mean Jewish domination of Arabs in Palestine. And again in 1937, Ben-Gurion still, if Palestine were uninhabited, we might have asked for a Jewish state. Before then it would not harm anyone else. But there are other residents in Palestine, and just as we do not wish to be at the mercy of others, they too have the right not to be at the mercy of the Jews. Now there are many who believe that proposals such as these were put forth hypocritically as a kind of a tactic. I don't agree. What I've been quoting are internal documents, rather substantive and concrete ones. I think that they reflected a commitment to justice and an understanding on the part of committed socialists as to what a new Lithuania or a new Montenegro would become. There are many reasons why such plans failed, but it is not necessary to relive that history. It seems to me that at this moment it is critically important for such alternatives to be considered and debated, and furthermore to be implemented by Jews and by Arabs who will be repelled by the imperial settlement and who will seek a more decent life. For Jews, I think this means returning to the concept of Zionism expressed by old settlers like Yitzhak Epstein, a concept that has long been forgotten for many years, though it was alive in the 1930s as it should have been. A concept of Zionism is based on justice and law, on absolute equality and human brotherhood.
And now Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard, will also speak to the question of what would you consider to be a just and lasting solution in the Middle East.
Thank you. I too want to disclaim, speaking on behalf of any organization, I'm not properly labeled in the program as representing a Zionist point of view. Zionists and Israelis frequently agree with me and frequently disagree with me. An article that I wrote some years ago was quite critical of some aspects of Israeli life, and I certainly don't want to be understood as speaking on behalf of any group or any organization. I'm speaking for myself and from deeply felt individual values. Discussing the Middle East with Noam Chomsky and before an organization consisting primarily of people from the peace community is an opportunity I have frankly long looked forward to. I've been deeply involved in the peace community and in the peace movement since its inception. Indeed, I've probably represented some of you or some organizations that you belong to, and certainly some of your friends or people with whom you identify. I think I share many of the same values that most of you find important. I generally view the world in much the same way you view it, and I identify with most of the same national and world leaders with whom you identify. For several years now, I've been agonizing with myself over the question, why then do so many of you come out so differently than I do on the issues surrounding the Arab-Israeli dispute? Why do so many people with whom I agree on so many issues look upon the Israeli cause with so much disdain and upon the Arab cause, particularly but not exclusively the Palestinian cause, with so much approval? To be sure, many of you would deny, and properly so, that characterization. You would say, as the American Friends Service Committee report says, that both sides are equally right, or as others have put it, both sides are equally wrong. When I hear that kind of argument, I'm reminded of the old story of the rabbi who heard the case before him of a husband and wife in a matrimonial situation, and first he heard the wife's version and said to the wife, you know, you're right. And then the husband came in and told his version, which was completely inconsistent, and the rabbi said, you know, you're right. And the rabbi's student who heard both these said, Rabbi, that's absolutely contradictory. He can't be right and she can't be right. To which the rabbi said, you know, you're right. It's a great virtue to see both sides of an issue, if there really are comparable rights and wrongs on both sides. But in my view, it's an equally great vice to see two comparable sides to an issue when they are truly not comparable. As I've said, I've been much agonized by the fact that so many of you, with whom I agree on so much, view these issues so differently from the way I do. I hope that some of you, too, who support the Arab cause have also been agonizing. Since so many of those with whom you agree on most other issues, so many of those with whom you have worked, marched, struck, been jailed, feel so differently from the way you do on that important issue. As Judge Learned Hand once said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. And he was fond of quoting Cromwell's statement, I beseech ye in the bowels of Christ, think that ye may be mistaken. That I submit as a healthy attitude with which all of us might consider this issue. With this brief introduction of mine, let me try to identify some of the values which I think we share, a deep and abiding commitment. Let's then ask ourselves whether those values push so inexorably toward the Arab side, or whether they even permit a moral person to conclude, as so many in the peace movement have, that there are comparable equities and inequities on both sides. Am I not correct in identifying the following values as among those which we all cherish most? First, of course, is a preference, some of us would use a stronger word, for peace over war. Closely related to that is a strong preference for the values of life and liberty over those of land and property. We all prefer societies where political and civil liberties are respected to those where repression and tyranny exist. Certainly those are the values from which Professor Chomsky spoke tonight. And most of us, I think, have a strong affinity for some kind of socialism, or at least for an equal distribution, or a more equitable distribution of income. We support the goals of the women's movement, and we oppose societies in which the rights of women are not recognized. We oppose colonialism and the denial of self-determination or of community control. Many of us will, and this perhaps is a value we do not all share, tend to identify with the underdog, with those who are being ganged up on rather than with those who seem to have the support of the gang. Now, I'm sure there are other values as well that we share, but I think I'm correct in concluding that most of us would put those values at or near the top of any list. Let's turn then to our preference for peace over war and the related preference for the values of life and liberty over those of land and property, and see on which side of the scale those preferences justly belong. To analyze that issue, it is, I think, best to distinguish between the Middle East situation as it existed before the 1967 war and the situation as it existed prior to that war, beginning with the pre-1967 and focusing primarily on the 1947-49 period, to which Professor Chomsky alluded. It's difficult for me to find any justification for the massive Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian attack on the tiny state of Israel, which had been lawfully established by the United Nations and recognized by the Soviet Union and the United States. The UN decision contemplated the establishment of a Jewish and a Palestinian state. Sure, Ben-Gurion had stated views inconsistent with that, but those views were stated before the massacres in Palestine, before it became clear that Jew and Arab would not find it easy to live together in one single state. And when the two states were to be established, Israel made it clear that any Arabs living within its territory were welcome either to remain or to move to the Palestinian state. To be sure, this arrangement entailed some hardships and difficult choices for the Arabs of Jaffa, Haifa, and other cities, whether to remain in their homes as minority members of a Jewish state, or to leave their cities and towns in which they grew up and to move several kilometers to the Palestinian state, where they would constitute a majority. The Jews who lived in the part of the mandate that was to be an Arab state faced a similar choice. They too could, in theory at least, remain a minority in the Arab states, and some chose to do so but were expelled. Or they could move several kilometers to the Jewish state, which most chose to do. Population shifts of this kind, while not pleasant to those being shifted, have always been regarded as a civilized, though necessary evil, to be endured in the interests of more important values. Many countries throughout history have required its citizens to leave their native cities, their villages, and their states when economic, health, military, and other considerations called for such relocation. Nasser, for example, moved thousands of Egyptian villagers in order to build the Aswan Dam. Of course the villagers objected, as any of us would, as did the North Cambridge Street community in Alston several years ago that was required to break itself up and move to make way for a large housing project. They had a legitimate gripe, as did the Jaffa Arabs and the Hebron Jews. But to elevate that objection into a moral justification for the taking of human life is something I find difficult to understand. Putting that aside for a minute, I'm going to return to it. Let's get back to the Arab decision to invade Israel at that point in time. That decision, of course, was not justified on the basis of the Palestinian refugees, since there were no refugees at that time. The Arab invasion, I think it's conceded by all men of goodwill, created the refugee problem. What then was the justification for the attack? To answer that, let me not quote Israeli propaganda sources. Let me quote a source who Professor Chomsky often relies on and himself quotes, Daniel Amit, whose article appeared on the desk when some of you walked in, a prominent anti-Zionist who strongly opposes the Israeli position on virtually everything. I quote him in the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books. It's reasonable to believe that during the years preceding and immediately following the creation of the state, the Arabs attacked out of a desire for the annihilation of the Jewish state, and that the main urge in Israel was the defense of its existence, which was, and I'm using Amit's words, conceived in terms of genocide. Israel posed no threat to Egypt, to Syria, to Jordan, to Iraq. Yet those countries set out to destroy the lawfully established state and to drive its Jewish inhabitants into the sea. And that's not rhetoric. If it is conceded that the Arabs, with no lawful justification, started the 47-49 war, then it must be acknowledged, at the very least, that they bear significant responsibility for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. There is, as you all know, significant dispute as to the immediate facts surrounding the exodus of the Palestinians from Israel. But there is no dispute that the Arab invasion was an important but-for cause. Nor is there any dispute that the Mufti of Jerusalem and the Arab High Executive were calling for the Arabs to leave Israel and were threatening reprisals against those who did not. There is dispute about Israel's attitude, and despite the fact that official Israeli policy was to persuade the Arabs to remain, it is reasonable, I think, to conclude that many Israelis were personally gratified by their departure, and that many Arabs left out of fear of what might befall them if they remained. Another anti-Zionist who Professor Chomsky is fond of quoting, I.F. Stone, summarized the situation in a contemporaneous account, which he wrote in 1948, as follows. Ill-armed, outnumbered, however desperate their circumstances, the Jews stood fast. The Arabs very early began to run away. First the wealthy families went. It was estimated that 20,000 left the country in the first 2 months of hostilities. While the Arab guerrillas were moving in, the Arab civilian population was moving out. Or as Al Difya, a Jordanian daily, put it in 1954, quote, the Arab governments told us to get out so that we could get in. We got out, but they did not get in. But even assuming the worst now, for argument's sake, even rewriting history to agree with the current Palestinian account that the Israelis ordered the Arabs to leave, all the Arabs to leave, how does that justify the violence and the terrorism used by the Arab governments and the Palestinian commandos to regain their land? Let's assume, what is clearly not the case, but let's assume it anyway, that all the Palestinians were expelled unlawfully, immorally, and without justification. Where does forced expulsion from one's native village or town fit on a moral ranking of injustices? Before answering that question, let's be careful not to confuse expulsion on the one hand with denial of self-determination, with placement in refugee camps, with denial of political freedom or nationhood on the other hand, because we must again recall what is after all not disputed. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state in the mandate. It was not Israel who at that point destroyed that dream. It was Jordan who annexed the Palestinian state and made it part of its Hashemite kingdom. It was Jordan who denied the Palestinians the right to self-determination, political freedom, and nationhood. Israel bears no part of that important responsibility. Israel can be held responsible, at the very most, for expelling Arabs from the Jewish state into what was supposed to be a Palestinian state. Though the evidence on that, as I said, is at best ambiguous, I am willing, for purposes of this argument, to assume that Israel expelled the Arabs and did so wrongfully. And now back to the central moral question. Where does expulsion fit on the moral scale of injustices? By asking that question, I don't mean to deny the self-evident proposition that expulsion from one's birthplace is a serious infringement, but I mean to ask you to think very hard and try to place that infringement in a comparative perspective. Surely forced expulsion is not nearly as bad as forced imprisonment, denial of political liberties, denial of life itself, or forced retention in a country against one's will. The right to leave an oppressive or repressive society has always been regarded, and rightfully so, as a more fundamental human liberty than the right to return to a society, even one's homeland. Every document of liberty that I am aware of protects the right to leave, to be free from oppression. Some also protect the right to remain or return, but none that I know of ranks the right to live in a particular land anywhere close to the right to be free not to live in a particular land, to be free from the oppression that's entailed by living under a rulership with which one disagrees. After all, denial of the right to live in a particular place, even a symbolically important place, even one's home, does not preclude living freely in many other places, as numerous Palestinians have in fact done, and as all would have been allowed to do and should have been allowed to do, but for the Jordanian annexation of the EQed Palestinian state. It is important to remember that Israel has never denied any Palestinian the right to live in complete freedom with full political rights in any part of the world except Israel. Again, taking the Palestinian claim most seriously, taking it at its extreme, the most that can be said is that Israel has denied the Palestinians the right to live freely in their homeland. I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but I'm trying to distinguish that from other important deprivations and injustices. How many times throughout history have people been denied the right to live in a particular place? How many times through history have the Jews been expelled from their birthplaces, from Judea, from England, from Spain, from villages throughout Europe, and most relevantly from numerous Arab countries where they had lived for thousands of years? Others have been expelled as well. Frenchmen born in Algeria, living there for 100 years, expelled from Algeria. Cubans from Cuba, Indians from Kenya, just to mention some of the most recent examples. Indeed, as I'm sure you will all agree, expulsion is often preferable to its alternatives. If only the Jews of Syria and Iraq were now expelled instead of being kept captive. If only the Jews of Germany had been expelled in 1939, as likely they would have been had any country in the world been willing to take them in. This is not to suggest that resigned acceptance is the only appropriate response to exclusion, to expulsion, but it is to suggest, in the strongest possible terms, that armed violence is not an appropriate response to expulsion. I am not, as some of you are, a pacifist. I believe that killing to save life is sometimes appropriate. I also believe that on rare occasions, armed violence to secure liberty is appropriate. But I can never, under any circumstances, justify killing to secure property, even when that property is one's birthplace, one's homeland. To be sure, most wars have been fought precisely to gain property, to gain territory. Napoleon, Alexander, Hitler. But that is just the reason why we in the peace movement oppose most wars, and why it is that we tend to favor only those wars that are fought to protect liberty, to protect freedom, not to regain homelands, not to protect property. That, I would have thought, would be an absolute tenet of the peace movement and of the Quaker religion. And that is why I have so much difficulty understanding how so many of you see so much virtue in the Palestinian position, which espouses the use of violence to retake land. For there is no denying that at bottom, this is the Palestinian position in relation to Israel. The only even arguably justifiable complaint the Palestinians have against Israel is that they were expelled from their towns and villages. To be sure, the Palestinians have a far more significant complaint against those who denied them self-determination, nationhood, and freedom. The use of Palestinian violence against their Jordanian oppressors would seem to me to be far more reasonable. But it is so much easier to generate support for a holy war against people of a different religion than against one's co-religionists. Expulsion, though serious, as I have said, ranks fairly low on the scale of moral wrongs. And the expulsion at issue here, complicated as it is by the fact that it was caused, at least in substantial part, by Arab invasion and demand for Palestinian evacuation, ranks, in my view, at the very bottom of an already low category of wrongs. Put most directly, never in recent history has so slight a moral wrong been seen by so many otherwise sensitive people as justifying so great an amount of violence. To put the issue in a realistic perspective, compare the plight of the Palestinians with that of the Jews who lived in Hebron before the establishment of Israel. That ancient city had a Jewish community for centuries. A few years before the establishment of Israel, all the Jews of Hebron were expelled, following an Arab massacre in which many were slaughtered. Of this, I think there is no dispute. Are the Jews who were expelled from Hebron and their descendants now entitled to retake that community by violence? Most assuredly not. Indeed, the attempt of certain Jews to reestablish a Jewish population in Hebron without force has raised an outcry from Noam Chomsky and from many of you. Yes, the Jews were wrongly expelled, but it doesn't follow that they or their descendants must now be permitted to return, and it certainly does not follow that they should be permitted to return by the use of violence. How, then, to ask a lawyer's question, can the case of the Hebron Jews be distinguished from that of the Palestinian Arabs? Why do so many of you, who condemn the non-forcible attempt to resettle Hebron, condone the forcible attempt to resettle the land from which the Palestinians claim to have been expelled? I urge you to think hard about this issue. Ask yourselves whether you can really justify the use of force, especially the kind of force used by the Palestinian terrorists in the Arab countries, to regain land from which they claim to have been expelled. Ask yourself whether you think the right to live in one town in Palestine rather than in another town in Palestine, important though it is important enough to kill over. Ask yourself whether you who support the Palestinian claim haven't fallen prey to an exaggerated claim of injustice. I regard myself as a person extremely sensitive to injustice and denial of liberty. I've devoted my life to trying, in a meager way, to prevent injustices. And I cannot, as hard as I try, and I think I try to do it sincerely, I cannot understand how anyone can justify killing as an appropriate response to expulsion, especially the expulsion at issue here. Turning back to the 1967 war as a watershed. Before that war, there was little else at issue other than the rights of the Palestinians to recapture their land and the desire of the Arab governments to destroy Israel. Israel asked no more than to be allowed to live in peace within its armistice line of 1949. Virtually no one in Israel during that period of time called for expansion of the territories. Indeed, Moshe Sneh, the head of the Israel Communist Party and no supporter of Israel governmental policies, made the following statement to a group of Palestinian leaders in 1968, and I quote, "The Israeli government's offer to transform the demarcation lines into permanent frontiers held good for 20 years right up to June 5th of last year when the Six-Day War broke out. And I can assure you, he said, that as late as the morning of June 6th, if any Arab ruler had come forward and said, let's sign a peace treaty on the Rhodes lines, not a single Israeli minister or politician would have refused. He concludes, every Israeli I know, and that goes for the Cheirut leaders, Menachem Begin, would have jumped at the opportunity and would have resisted going to war. But the Arabs would not recognize Israel in 1967. Instead, they attempted to strangle her by illegally blockading her critical port at Eilat. Egypt ordered the UN observers out of Sinai. It mobilized its troops. There was no claim that the Arabs were seeking to regain captured territories then. It was, and it says it was, seeking to destroy Israel. Israel attempted diplomatic action, and then it engaged in a preemptive strike that ended the war quickly and with relatively few casualties. The morality of that preemptive strike has become clearer and clearer with every passing day, especially since Yom Kippur of this war. Up until that point, up until the end of the 1967 war, it seems clear to me that the balance of equities lay so strongly on the side of Israel that it was not even fair to describe the situation as two-sided. And I'm not surprised that Professor Chomsky started with the early Zionists and then went to 1947 and skipped the whole period about which I'm speaking. Since 1967, the issues have become more complicated, at least in relation to the Arab states, though they remain identical in relation to the Palestinians, except that the Palestinians have escalated their terrorism and escalated their violence. A claim which did not justify the terrorism pre-1967 surely does not justify what's occurred since. Should Israel have returned the captured territories? If so, in return for what? I tend to believe that Israel miscalculated by not returning some territories unilaterally right away after its victory of 1967. But I cannot say that it acted immorally. Was it morally obligated to return the territories to Syria, which has still to this day not accepted the UN resolution of 1967 and still has not returned all Israel POWs from that war? Was it morally obligated to return territories to Jordan, which attacked Israel after Israel repeatedly pleaded with Hussein to stay out of the war and not to attack it? Was it morally obligated to return the Sinai, which acts as a military buffer against a massive tank attack at the heart of Israel? Of course I agree that no country should be able to acquire territory by aggression. But the issue is far more complex than that adage suggests. When the territory was obtained as a result of a war that Israel never would have begun, had not its very survival put in jeopardy by Arab action, and when that territory itself, or at least significant parts of it, are critical to its ability to defend itself from attacks such as those begun by the Arabs 6 weeks ago. Now we turn to something Professor Chomsky said. I have always regarded Professor Chomsky as very shrewd and very clever. Naivete is not one of his characteristics. But to hear him say today in front of this audience that the reason the European common market has turned against Israel has nothing to do with oil and has to do with the morality of Israel's position in beginning to build settlements in the West Bank is indeed laughable. Does anybody believe that? To suggest for one moment that the policy of any nation in the world depends for one moment on the morality or immorality of building a couple of roads and housing developments, a policy with which I personally disagree, on the West Bank is to be so naive as to invite ridicule. I cannot believe that anybody could seriously maintain that the world's oil crisis has in any way been contributed to by the morality or immorality of Israel's actions on the West Bank. Israel is isolated because it is an underdog, because the oil in the world, as Golda Meir said, Moses, our leader, was so smart. He took us 40 years through the Middle East and wandered only to come to the only piece of land in the Middle East without any oil. Had Moses made a different turn, or had Ben-Gurion made a different turn, or had fortuities been different, the world situation would be different. Not because Israel is engaging in some foolish and perhaps immoral settlements, but because power is oil and because power is money. Before I return to this issue in the form of evaluating some of the prospects of peace, let me just briefly turn to the other of the shared values that I tried to identify earlier, and I'm near the end of my remarks now. I don't want to go into much detail, since I think few fair-minded persons would deny that despite its lack of perfection, Israel shines by comparison with every other Arab state, and all but a handful of states throughout the world in civil liberties, political freedom, feminism, distribution of income. It is a flawed socialist society, to be sure. It is a flawed democracy. But even with its flaws, it is not, as Daniel Berrigan recently called it, a criminal Jewish community that employs racist ideology comparable to that used by the Nazis, and it is not, as Noam Chomsky has put it, a repressive society. It is not a society dominated by religious groups. It is a society which is less dominated by religion than Boston is. It is a society which is freer and more open than most parts of the world. Were I in Israel today, I would be a member of the Civil Liberties Union, and I would be fighting the government at every turn, every time it tried to take territory away, every time it tried to use pretrial detention, just as I fight this government at every turn. But I don't call this government a repressive society, and neither is Israel a repressive society. Egypt is a repressive society. Iraq is a repressive society. Syria is a repressive society. Cuba is a repressive society. Israel, by any standard, is not. I'll just take one more minute responding. Nor does Amnon Rubinstein, who Professor Chomsky is fond of quoting, think it's a repressive society. He thinks it's one of the freest societies of the world, and only when his remarks are taken out of context can he be made to look as if he's against the Israeli government. Read him in the New York Times, and you'll see what Rubinstein says about the Israeli society. Let me focus on just one other value. I'll take one more comment. Let me focus on just one other value to comment on Professor Chomsky's claim for binationalism. There's very little with which I disagree in what he says, in the sense that I think if the citizens of Israel and the citizens who should live in a Palestinian state decide that they prefer a binational state to two separate national states, who would I be to complain about that? That's what democracy is all about. I certainly would not want to force Arabs and Jews to live together in one state unless the majority of both communities chose to do so. I certainly favor community control and self-determination. I don't see any virtue in forcing people to live together who have proved in the past an inability and a difficulty to live together. I want to see self-determination. Israel should, of course, recognize the Palestinians, should recognize the Palestinians, and should recognize the legitimacy of their claims for what they are. Legitimate, not all that pressing, substantial, not overwhelming, justify compensation, justify some attempt to reintegrate as many as possible safely within the community, but do not justify terrorism. That's the extent to which Israel should recognize. Now, I only have one more minute left, and I'm just going to briefly set out the immediate outlines of a proposal and wait for the rest and answer to questions. My proposal is this. Israel should announce immediately its willingness in principle to withdraw from all occupied territories captured in 1967 in return for firm assurances of real peace. What do I mean by firm assurances for real peace? I would not have Israel trade land for paper guarantees. It should indicate that it does not wish to hold on to territories, for purposes of economics, for purposes of colonialization, but merely as an assurance of peace. It should announce it in principle now, and it should begin a phased withdrawal, slowly and consistently, with Arab indications that it too wants to live in peace. This is not a quick solution. It may indeed take to the end of the century before Israel can justifiably conclude that the new generation of Arabs is not bent on its destruction. When that time comes, hopefully it will come sooner, perhaps within a decade, Israel has no legitimate interest in holding on to the territories it holds on to. But Israel should not exchange the security of defensible borders for paper documents, as Czechoslovakia did many years ago. It should not exchange land in the hope that the world community, which has abandoned it in the face of oil, which the United Nations has made a mockery of it, would support it in desperate hours. But it should, and this is consistent with my opening principle, be willing to exchange land, which is after all nothing, in order to keep real peace. And that's my view.
Part of the standard ethics of public debate is that the person who by accident or choice speaks second doesn't address himself to the remarks of the person who spoke first, but rather to the topic. And if he does so, he does not distort them. Now, I'm not going to respond to this whole range of things, obviously, because that would itself violate the ethics of debate. I'll simply...
Feel free.
No, I won't. But I will respond. For example, I will not explain that I skipped 1947 to 1967 simply because of lack of time. And of course, it was precisely during that period that the overwhelming Israeli terrorism occurred against the Arab people. Simply count up the casualties in that period. But the point that I want to make is that if anyone else misheard me on the European oil price, on the European response to the oil thing, the way Alan apparently did, let me disabuse you of that misinterpretation. What I said, I was commenting, of course it's obvious and trivial that the that the common market is taking the position that it now does. In fact, the whole rift with the United States developed on the basis of oil politics. What I was talking about was something totally different. In fact, since I wrote out my remarks, I can quote them to you. What I was saying, I was commenting on the what I called curiously irrelevant view of many of American liberals. I was thinking in particular of the economists who gave a statement the other day, saying that if united, the oil countries, the West could resist the oil boycott. And I pointed out that there is not the slightest reason to expect the European countries to choose to be united with the United States in resisting the oil boycott, because they do not approve in the first place of the position that the United States is accepting. So it's not a matter of, it's perfectly true that their adherence to American-imposed policies would never have led them to force their own solution in the Middle East, even if they had been able to in the past. But under present circumstances, it's quite mistaken to expect that the European Common Market will accept any, will be willing to accept any sacrifice at all in order to follow policies of the United States of which they do not approve.
The implication being that if Israel had acted differently, the European world oil community would now be acting differently.
If Israel, yes, of course, if the issue were not, as it is, permanent occupation of the occupied territories, I think it would be, if, for example, it were true, as you mistakenly claim, I believe, that the goal of the Arab states was to destroy Israel, and if there were any credible reason to believe that, if there were any, at this moment, if there were any credible reason to believe that, you would find, I am sure, that the states of the European Common Market would undertake to unite, and probably would unite with the United States in preventing that. But that's not the situation.
Well, shall we get on to some questions? We're going to ask you to try to limit your questions to, sort of a maximum of 2 minutes in the formulating of the question, and try not to use the question to, if possible, to go into a long statement of your own personal position. And just a quick reminder that the purpose of this meeting is informational, and I think we'd get along much better if we, listened very well to each other and tried to keep things as cool and as unemotional as possible. Okay? Over here, yes.
Professor Chomsky, are you ready to live in the country in the way you propose? Are you ready to go and live under those circumstances?
Which circumstances?
Those which you have proposed. Do you think it's...
I'm not ready to live under any of the alternatives that I propose. That's why I live here.
This is why you do these proposals. So it's very easy to sit here and to do these proposals.
It is equally easy to do any of the other proposals. See, on your grounds, it's equally irrelevant to propose that Israel should conquer everything, or that there should be 2 states, or that there should be any proposal that one makes is irrelevant on your grounds. On your grounds, one should say nothing at all.
Except the proposal to leave it up to the people there to decide by
Oh, I agree. See, I agree perfectly well to leave it up to the people there, but let's not overlook a few small facts. Both in 2 respects. First of all, you see, by making proposals about what happens there, I do not fail to leave it up to the people there. You see, I'm equally willing to make proposals about what should happen in the Soviet Union, as you are. I'm equally willing to make proposals about Russian repression of dissent. I'm equally willing to make proposals about the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. I feel no hesitation in making proposals about other societies or about Israel. Now, in the case of Israel, there are 2 reasons why this normal right to talk about what is happening elsewhere are increased. The 2 reasons are, first, that as an American citizen, I am directly contributing massively to the implementation of Israeli and Saudi Arabian and Jordanian policy through the enormous American capital and gifts to these countries, primarily to Israel, which has by far the highest per capita American aid of any country in the world. Secondly, and that alone, you see, we could, if we wanted, rephrase this entire issue as to whether the United States should continue to pour massive resources, let's say, into a policy of making it possible for territories to be dealt with the way that I described, whether it should pour massive resources into resettling of Jewish immigrants, $75 million in the last aid bill at the expense of Palestinians. This is with these questions we could immediately discuss as Americans, quite apart from our perfect right to discuss what happens in Russia, in Israel, in Brazil, or in any other country. Secondly, quite apart from that, so first there's a general right that you or I or anyone else has to discuss these issues. Secondly, there is an extra right that we have as Americans who are directly contributing massively to particular policies. Thirdly, there is the fact that as a Jew, the Israeli state claims to speak for me, you see. The Israeli state, for example, in Supreme Court decisions, claims, I quote, that there is no Israeli nation apart from the Jewish people, and that people includes the Jews of Israel and the diaspora. And as such, they claim to have a right to speak for me. Well, if they have a right to speak for me, I should think I have a right to speak about them. And for these various reasons, the general right to speak about anything anywhere in the world, Russia, Germany, Brazil, whatever, the right to speak about a country where American policy is directly imposing not only a country, but a region where American policy and my tax money is directly imposing particular solutions. And thirdly, the fact that as a Jew I have a special interest in it seems to me to abrogate entirely the basis for your question.
So since it's one of Professor Chomsky's admirable qualities that whether the objects of his remarks want him to speak or not, he will speak if he feels moved to, I don't think that particular topic bears further discussion, but I think you have been very disingenuous in your remarks, most recently in your attempt to explain away Professor Dershowitz's comments on the situation in Europe. They came, you will recall, in the context of saying that it was not a peculiar African trait to object to changes in borders by force. I think those who call it a peculiar trait think to the fact that the African boundaries were drawn geometrically in Europe without regard to the particular facts of Africa. And then you moved on to say it is also the case, those are not your exact words, but the substance of your words, in Europe. And I think it's the case that only a few years ago, Chancellor Willy Brandt won a Nobel Peace Prize for accepting substantial changes in borders and shifts of populations in Europe occasioned by war. And I think that a recognition of that fact moves us back to the very complex moral argument that Professor Dershowitz tried to construct, into which you chose, under the ethics of debate, not to respond to. Under the ethics of question and response, I would like you to confront what I think is the very brilliant and complex moral argument that bears serious study that Professor Dershowitz made.
Well, I'm delighted you asked that. First, let me again point out, because it gives me a chance now, within the ethics of response, to discuss what I would have liked to discuss in the first place. However, let me again point out that you have apparently totally misunderstood what I said about the oil thing. And I'll try once again to say it very simply. Yeah. No, I don't do that because I have the words sitting here right in front of me. See, what I was saying is that you misheard, but if you want to try to understand it, or you want to forget that issue?
I'd like to try that.
All right, the issue then is very plain and simple. What I said is that we hear statements here that if united, the Western powers could resist the oil boycott. But such comments are curiously irrelevant, since they fail to recognize that Western Europe has never accepted the American policy of its... Just a minute. Yeah, I started by saying that I quoted an Israeli analyst who pointed out quite accurately that the African attitude towards the African decisions of breaking relations and so on were not simply pressure or cowardice or anything else, but they were motivated by the main reason was the African attitude to changing borders by force. Then I said that argument is not peculiar to Africa. Rather, similar observations apply here as well. In Europe, there has never been acceptance of the American position that Israel is entitled to change its borders by force. Therefore, it is pointless to expect European countries to agree to be united with the United States in overcoming the oil boycott, which is an effort to reverse this. Now, I don't see how anything could be simpler than
You're going to
that.
stick with the argument that the main reason, if I hear you correctly, the
No.
main reason...
Why they will refuse to be united.
No. You're talking about the Africans now. The main reason. Read that sentence again. The
I'm
main
quoting,
reason has to do with...
there is
the
every
molecular-
reason, well, I'll quote the Israeli analyst.
No. Yourself.
I didn't say a word. I just quoted the Israeli analyst. If you want, do you want to know what I thought or what I said? What I said was entirely a quotation of an analysis in Haaretz, which I think is correct,
If this
which
were a
pointed out
courtroom, I would seek discovery of the documents and have
right in
it
front
myself.
of you.
Why don't you go
Right
on
in
to the
front
next
of you.
answer
You can
and I'll
find
read
it. You'll find that it's exactly as out of context as this comment
I
was.
think that's probably
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, zero in other words.
Yeah,
Saltpeter.
back
Wait a
to
minute,
the-
just a minute. I
I'm
wanted to
sorry.
respond to the respond to the exact question.
Okay.
Now, Ms. Dershowitz made a number of points. The main one that he made was basically that the terrorism and violence of the Palestinians to recover the land from which they had either fled or been expelled, we can overlook that, is not justified. But what he failed to deal with is the fact that since, certainly since early 1948, since February or March 1948, the primary violence to this day is Israeli. You see, it's perfectly true. Now, if you want, I'll go through the record, a record which he omitted and which I didn't talk about, not because I didn't want to mention it because of lack of time. You see, the fact is that although the Arab states did invade on May 15th, 1948, that was after a long civil war in the country in which the Palestinians had been virtually wiped out by their military forces had been virtually destroyed by Israeli force. Count up the number of casualties. Just a minute. Oh yes, but there was the fighting began early in December 1947. In fact, it began with Arab attacks, but quickly became two-sided. And by very quickly, well, you see, there are a lot of things you people may not know. But if you look back at the documents, including the Zionist histories, you'll discover that in the period from December 1947 through May 14th, 1948, that is prior to the Arab attack, there was plenty of fighting in the country, plenty of massacres on both sides, plenty of use of military force, many, many people killed, and the Jews had by far the better of it. And if just a minute, you asked me to talk, you asked me to respond to the moral issue about killing, right? Okay, now, then let us go on to the later period, all right? If we do go on to the later period, we will discover, for example, let's say after the ceasefire, okay? Let's start with the ceasefire at Rhodes in 1949. Well, 2 weeks after the ceasefire, Israel conquered the city of Eilat. 2 weeks after the ceasefire, Israel conquered the city of Eilat. It was then an Arab village. It was taken then. From that point on, there have been a consistent series of Israeli attacks, and if you make the grisly and unpleasant calculation of how many dead there are on both sides, there is not the slightest doubt that the great mass of people killed by this, by the struggle between Israel and its neighbors, who then included the ejected Palestinians, that in that the overwhelming terrorism was conducted by the Israelis. I mean, just a minute. For example, shall I give you a few examples? In 1950, for example, Israel undertook to expel about 4,500 Bedouins from the El Auja area in Sinai. They were peaceful Bedouins. There had been no struggling there. We have the UN documents. We can see that Israel conducted a military attack and expelled. Just, do you want me to answer? A question was asked to me about terror. Okay. Frankly, I don't like this kind of counting up with casualties on both sides. But since you raised the question, I will do it. You asked about the moral. You asked about the moral calculus. All right. I'm responding to your moral argument as follows. From the Palestinians in Palestine, everywhere, as an organized group at least, did not accept the UN decision. There was plenty of fighting up and back in which the Jews got the upper hand. There were many people killed. I mean, the people of Jaffa and Haifa, for example, didn't have just a painful decision to make in April 1947. Rather, they were attacked there was a military attack on Jaffa. There was also a military attack on Haifa prior to any statement saying, please stay. Now, from the later, and this went on through the entire period, fighting up and back. Incidentally, I hold no brief for the Arab states in this, and shouldn't be misinterpreted as such, but no, not at all. I'm responding to what happened. The Palestinians were forced out by violence, often by calculated means. Their villages were destroyed. There is no record, incidentally, of any plea on the part of the Arab higher executive that the Arabs leave. These claims have been demolished long ago by Erskine Childers and others who've done research on it. But then if we go into the later period, we find such things as those that I started to mention to you. For example, the expulsion of the Bedouins in El Auja region in 1950. We find the attack on the El Bureig refugee camp in 1953. We find the Kibbutz massacre in 1953 when, 66 people or so were killed. Straight a simple attack by the Israeli army on the Jordanian village, denied at first by Ben-Gurion, then later admitted to be true. We find the Nahalin attack in March 1954. We find the Gaza raid in February 1955, and on and on. I won't go through the whole ugly story. But if we do it, we will discover many direct military attacks, in fact, by units which were devised for that purpose. One of them held, just a minute. Yeah, this responds precisely, because the point is that after having basically expelled the Arab population in the course of the fighting of 1948, and that was a tricky moral issue, because I think there really were two sides there. But after that period, Israel continued to do two things. First of all, to conduct direct terroristic attacks on the Palestinians, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians in the periphery, and secondly, to conduct something parallel inside the country, which was quite ugly, namely expropriation of Arab lands, about 1 million dunams, according to rather conservative calculations, within the 10 years up to 1958, creation of areas where Arabs who lived there were not permitted to settle, and so on and so forth. Now, it seems to me that in this, I'm giving only one side, incidentally, because you asked me to respond to a moral argument which totally omitted all of these facts. You don't, really?
What do you understand?
The argument, in fact, I quoted it, was that violence, the Palestinians, he said, espouse violence to retake land, and armed violence is not an appropriate response to expulsion. Never has so slight a moral wrong justified such a great amount of violence. So what is happening is here a balance against an alleged a moral wrong of some value versus the amount of violence that's undertaken in response to it. Now, what I'm saying is that if we look at the situation not the way he did, but as the facts indicate, we will see that the overwhelming mass of violence throughout this period was conducted by the Israeli state.
Can I respond?
Precisely because it had the most power. Now, this is not to say that there is no moral dilemma there. There is a moral dilemma.
Can I respond?
There is a moral dilemma. But it is not stated in the terms that he described, because what he overlooked is that those who espoused violence were primarily the Israeli state.
Mr. Dershowitz would like to
Yes.
respond.
Of course, there's no denying that when Palestinians began to engage in terroristic violence, Israel responded. And to be sure, it responded somewhat successfully. To count casualty figures, of course, is to produce a result that Germany was morally superior to the West in the Second World War because they had more casualties than the West did. It's an absurd kind of argument. Is it not clear to everybody here, including Professor Chomsky, that at the point when the Israeli state was established, Israel had no motive for violence, no motive for bloodshed? It simply responded to violence. It may have overreacted, it may have overresponded, but is it not clear that at any given point in time, if the Arabs said, we won't fight anymore, we won't kill anymore, that Israel would have said the same, that they would not have killed? Is it not clear that the violence, no matter whose was greater or worse, what was responsive, is it not clear that but for the Arab attack, Israel would not have responded violently?
No,
now
that
let
is
me
not
get...
true.
Let me
Because there was
respond.
no Arab attack up to May 15th, and there was plenty of violence, like Deir Yassin.
Well, you said there was a civil war.
That was
Obviously,
Deir
there
Yassin
was a civil
response to the
war.
Arab attack?
There was a civil war in which Jewish communities were being attacked and were attacking back. It was a horrible situation. For every Deir Yassin, there were 15 or 20 assassinations of doctors and nurses going up to Hadassah Hospital. There were attacks in Hebron. Of course one can find Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin, of course, happened well after. The Arab evacuation of the Sharon, for example, began. These are complicated issues, but one thing is clear. There came a point in time, let's talk about it as May 15th, 1948, when Israel declared its independence. There came that point in time where, were it not for Arab attacks, there would have been no violence in the Middle East. That's the crux of my moral argument. Now, I want to continue to make a couple of other responses to the variety of points that were made. The virtue of discovery in legal proceedings has become clear to me. Professor Chomsky is right. He quoted out of context from his own speech precisely the way he quoted out of context of the thing he gave me. Let me read to you what Professor Rubinstein says. He says, remember, Professor Rubinstein is being urged in support of a repressive society. And my argument was, Professor Rubinstein does not say that Israel is a repressive society, whereupon I am dramatically handed a book. Here's what Professor Rubinstein says. Israel is a state of law, and its social structure rests on the rule of law. But the wing in which the uprooted people of Biram dwell is somewhat in disrepair. Whoever is familiar with Israeli law knows that the principle of legality weakens somewhat whenever an incident arises in which security reasons are advanced. I might have written that myself.
Please continue.
I agree. And then he talks about, he talks about the incidents there, and he makes the point. But the context for the remark is plainly that Israel is a society that believes and abides in the rule of law and deviates, and when it deviates, it should be criticized.
It deviates
if you
in
can
the issue
show
of
me,
military security,
on occasion,
which is precisely
on
what
occasion,
I stated.
if you can show me,
what is taken out of context?
but if you can show me that Israel is somehow a repressive society through the words of Amnon Rubinstein, who is a friend, and who I know very well.
Look, you misunderstand. Amnon Rubinstein is a committed Zionist. He's on your side, not mine. What I said is that even Amnon Rubinstein points out that the moment the word security is uttered, the wheels of the machine of justice slow down, and this happens even when those security reasons cannot convince a reasonable man.
I agree with all
As
that.
in the case of Biram and Crete, where the men they were illegally. So then what's out of context?
That's not a repressive society.
Did I say he called it a repressive society?
No, but when I said he didn't call it a repressive
You claimed
society,
that I took it out of
you handed me the document as if to
because
show
you
me
made
it
a
did.
statement which was
Okay.
false that I had taken it out of context.
I would
I really
suggest
do have
that
to complete my statement.
I would suggest that we don't get into points of documentation and who said what. You know, we try to move on.
But
and
he
give
interrupted
a
the
lot
middle of my
people-
sentence with the beginning of his.
Well, could you?
And I think I was in the process of making
could you
a response.
finish it up real
Sure.
quick so we can get
Sure.
on to some other questions? I think Can I have your attention? We'd like to get as many questions as possible from as many different people as possible, and that's the point. So, Mr. Dershowitz would like to quickly finish up his reply, and then we'll move on.
I
to another
apologize for interrupting the beginning of Mr. Chomsky's statement with the middle of mine, but I do want to have a chance to finish what I said. When I asked for his document, this is what it says. I suspect that these programs, and he's talking about the programs of creating settlements on the West Bank, that these programs were a function of the timing, at least, of the October War. He's making the argument a function or a factor in the timing, strengthens my position, in the timing of the October War. Furthermore, this is the point, they go a long way to explaining the hostility to Israel on the part of the African states. That is what he said. That is what I want him to justify. That, in fact, the hostility of the African states, and indeed the hostility of the European states, can really be explained not in terms of the oil boycott, not in terms of the realpolitik, and not in terms of anything other than the few settlements built on the West Bank.
All right, no, that is not what you asked me, but since you asked it, I'll be glad to answer. We know, that Mr. Salpeter, who I was quoting here, is correct.
I read you
because,
your own statement.
Yes, and we know that my statement is correct, that they go a long way towards explaining the hostility of Israel, because these things took place long before there was any oil blackmail. And in fact, if you look at Salpeter's full article, which I urge you to do, you'll discover that he gives a detailed analysis explaining that Zaire has no, is not subject to any kind of oil boycott. It's a rich country. It has no Muslim association. He goes on and on. I also have that document here if you like. And therefore, these events, which took place, incidentally, long before the war, this is describing events that took place before the war, before there was an oil boycott, were motivated by in very large measure, as I say, they are explained, we go a long way towards explaining them when we recognize that, in fact, these programs of permanent occupation, of repression of the population of the occupied territories, of slowly building facts which will lead to, in effect, annexation, and in fact, annexation without rights, that these explain precisely why people like Mobutu, who's being discussed here, reversed their long-standing policy of friendship to Israel. There was just as much fear of oil back in 1960.
Let's get on. This gentleman over here has had his hand up for a long time.
But it seems to me some of the things that were referred before, perhaps in years gone by, I think that in this December or this November we stand in a very different historical context than we've stood in long before, and I would like you gentlemen both to address that context. And I would propose, polemically, that within the next 4 months we stand a 70-30 chance of entering World War III. And I'd like to hear your responses and your conjectures as why my statistics might, or why my probability figures are wrong.
I don't think that there's very much chance of a world war, because I think it's much more likely that the United States will resort to the other policy option that was open to it, namely the Rogers Plan. And the Rogers Plan, I think, will undercut, if it can, under that scenario that I described, the only real possibility of war would be if Israel would refuse to accept the American pressure, and I don't think that's very likely. So my own guess is that we don't face the probability of war at all. Though, of course, there's enough tension there. There are apparently nuclear weapons there on both sides, and it is a conceivable possibility.
I have difficulty enough limiting myself to the Middle East. I can't even begin to think in terms of the potentials for a war. They're not within the control of Israel or the Arab countries. If there's going to be a war, it's going to be because the United States and the Soviet Union's interests are in that direction, which I think they're not. So I think I agree with Professor Chomsky, essentially.
Okay, back here.
In the light of the idealism that you expressed on the part of the Zionist movement from its inception, and I know it's had an impact on you during your own life, what can be done when there is a negotiation table taking place to guarantee that justice will be carried through and nothing will be shoved down anyone's throat, either the Israelis or the Arabs? And from the intent of the remarks made this evening, it gave me the impression that Israel will have to accept the kind of solution that is imposed on it, otherwise there will never be peace. And I'm scratching my head and I'm saying to myself, everyone is talking about peace, but where is justice? And I would hope that the two can be correlated.
I agree, incidentally, that Israel will now, my guess is, I mean, obviously we can only speculate, that Israel will now have a solution shoved down its throat. But I do happen to think that the solution which will be shoved down its throat, though, as I stated, not in my opinion a good solution, is more just than the one that Israel was trying to establish. That is, Israel was trying to establish, and I gave some documentation, we'll be delighted to give more, a situation of permanent occupation of the occupied territories. Now, I also said that I thought it was irrational on the part of the Arabs to refuse to negotiate directly, but much more serious was Israel's complimentary refusal not only to negotiate with the Palestinians, but even to admit their existence. Okay, that was even worse. Now, the result of that joint collection of irrationalities, if you like, combined with the greater Israeli power and with their evident intention to gradually build up facts in the occupied territories which would lead to annexation or worse, as I described, was a certain stable situation. That situation has now been shattered. We have a new situation. In the new situation, I think the United States, which is the prime actor, is faced with risks that it is unwilling to accept, my guess is. I don't think the United States is willing to accept the rift with Europe, the crisis of oil profits, let's say, the threat of takeover by other Western capitalist societies of the oil resource. I don't think the United States is willing to face any of these threats, nor does it have to, because it had another alternative available. Namely, it could have imposed the Rogers Plan instead of supporting permanent Israeli occupation. And that's precisely what I think it will do. Now, that solution, incidentally, I think will probably give more security to Israel than its past situation. And this I agree with people like General Peled and others who've argued that the security thing was a total illusion and that Israel is safer with demilitarized zones and a formal peace settlement and a superpower guarantee than it is with occupation and hence tension and irredentism and so on. Quite apart from being somewhat more secure, arguably, though that's a iffy question, I think it is certainly more just in that it at least eliminates Israeli occupation of occupied territory. It means that those million Arabs there, say, will not have to be sort of third-class citizens, not only the kind of second-class citizens they would be if they were Arabs in Israel, but third-class citizens such as they would be in an area where the annexation doesn't even give them the grant of citizenship. So it's more just in that sense, but it's not very just. As I said, I think it's a bad solution. For one thing, because any solution imposed by the superpowers is bad. It's imposed in their interests. It will be modified in their interests. The states of the region will become playthings for their wishes and goals. That's all very bad. And secondly, because I don't think it meets the just demands of the people of the region in the way that I described.